Hi, friends. Thanks for joining us for this week's I Factor conversation. And listen, if you haven't already, I want to encourage you to go to ifactorbook.com and make sure that you pick up your copy of the I Factor. We're super excited about the release of my new book, and I know that it's going to be a tremendous blessing for you. We've been having these I Factor conversations with a variety of people because that's how significant the I Factor is. It really doesn't matter where you are in your position of life or your status or station, whether you are an athlete, an activist, a stay-at-home mom, whether you're leading a Fortune 500 company. The I Factor is a book for you, and it speaks to your whole life. The I Factor is literally about being healthy from the inside out and about leading your whole life well. And so we've been having a variety of these conversations. We've been talking about the subject of being single. We've talked to major leaders. We've also talked to the next generation and millennials and really addressed those challenges and issues from the I Factor perspective. And today we're going to talk about parenting. And so I'm joined with some good friends, but also great parents, Jacin and Mandy Humphrey. And we're going to talk about the I Factor and parenting. And let me tell you why this is so important, because we all know that one of the greatest areas of leadership is the job of being a parent, particularly because it's the family that shapes the next generation of leaders as it relates to our children. And so today we're going to talk about, in this I Factor conversation, parenting and the I Factor. Because the truth is, sometimes as parents, we can lose ourselves in the job of parenting, and we can be so focused on all of the things that are expected of us as parents, and sometimes even neglect ourselves. So Jacin, let me start with you. As a husband and a father, I know that it's a balancing act. How do you handle it, and how do you manage the balancing act of being a father, being a husband, but then also the demands that come on your career? Or let me ask it this way: what's the hardest part about accomplishing that balancing act?
Sure. I think you hinted at it just a moment ago. You know, it's time. Time is the greatest resource we have, but it's also the most difficult one to manage when you're a professional, when you are a husband, when you are leading a family, when you have kids. It's time, because there's so many demands. You feel like you're being stretched so many different ways. And it's something that really takes intentionality, and really for a long time was difficult to learn how to manage. The older I got and let God begin working in me, the more I started seeing that really it was about three things. It was about creating priorities and figuring out what are the things I absolutely need to do or want to do. What is the kind of father? Who am I as a corporate leader? Like, what are the things I want to accomplish, and how do I do that through my priorities? And then I had to protect it, had to say, hey, I've got to create time slots for these things and make sure I'm intentional about that. But then even more so, I then had to be present. So when I'm at home, I had to be very, very intentional about being at home and not letting those worlds kind of bleed over into each other. Because the moment they start bleeding into each other, then I find myself kind of in this vortex of seeing my kids grow up or seeing things happen on my job and feeling like I'm not a part of it.
Yeah.
And it's just that balancing act of time is very, very difficult.
You know, it's interesting that you talked about identity and how identity plays into how you set your priorities, because identity is one of the core concepts that I tackle in the I Factor. I think that before you can do anything well, you first have to settle the identity question. Who are you? Who are you at your core? How do you guys approach that as it relates to parenting? Because in society, we often are challenged to just emulate what we saw modeled for us as it relates to parenting. And that's great if you had, a Leave It to Beaver kind of family unit, but it becomes very problematic when your family experience was totally different or even antithetical to what you're trying to set up within your own family context. How did you guys go about settling that question? Is it an ongoing settling in terms of who are you? Who is the Humphrey family? What is your identity as it relates to your approach to family? Because that's what you ultimately communicate to your children. Talk to me a little bit about that process. What was it like? How did you even get there? Are you there yet?
Go ahead.
Well, Myself, I did not grow up in the best environment. I had a lot of struggles with family, abusive households, things of that nature. So at a young age, I decided that when I had kids, that I wanted to make sure that they did not have the same experience I did. I wanted to make sure that they grew up in a healthy home.
Yeah.
And so before I even started the dating process and the whole marriage process, I worked on myself and I made sure that my I factor was strong so that I could support what I wanted to live out. And it's really hard, especially with children. You need to have your I factor. You need to know it so that you can help them develop theirs as they grow.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly. You know, having some of the same difficulties growing up.
Yeah.
I think as parents, we came together early on and basically made the decision we want to reproduce the good and figure out how to not reproduce the bad. And understanding that now on the hindsight of our relationship with God and Him developing our I factor, looking back, understanding the perspective of the bad, that the bad was just the effect of an unhealthy I factor in someone else. And so we basically came together and said, you know, these are the things, these are the values we want our family to have. I would say we figured it out for a season, but as the kids are getting older, they change those seasons in life. It challenges that dynamic again. Okay, now that we have a daughter that's 10 and getting ready to head into teenage years, what is the family dynamic? What do we want it to look like? And then as my wife said, I think most importantly, not forcing our I factor onto our children, helping to figure out how God wired them and helping raise their I factor in their context and not forcing our dreams and our opinions and our thoughts on them, helping them to discover it on their own.
Yeah, and it really is. It really is a work because you know the intentionality of saying there are some things that we experience in our childhood that we definitely don't want to replicate. But then there are also some things that we do want to create as it relates to who we are and what is our family identity, particularly our faith, our principles, our values. But then also finding the balance so that you communicate those and they come through your family. But then you also create that space for your children to discover it within themselves.
Absolutely.
I think it's so interesting that we keep coming back in some way, shape, or form to the importance of this notion of identity. You know, who are you as an individual? Having to answer that question. Who is your family in terms of the core of your family unit? How do you define it? Why is it significant? And then how you communicate that to your children. And what I think is inextricably tied to the question of identity is really the why question. You know, what is important, but then also the why behind it. So, or maybe another way to say it is who is important. But I think the substratum or the foundation of the who question is also connected to the why question. Why have a family for some people? You know, we live in a day and time now, particularly when people have had experiences like you guys have had. And my experience was very similar. I grew up in a home where my father was not there. And a part of my challenge growing up was to literally have God heal the ache in my heart that was caused by my father being absent. And my dad and I now today have a great relationship, but growing up as a kid, I grew up angry and bitter because my father wasn't there. And what's interesting is I know a number of people who've had difficult experiences as children, whether it was the absence of family, whether it was abusive homes, whether it was unfortunate things that have happened, and they just decided, instead of wrestling with the who question so that they can establish a family the right way, they just decided to opt out of it. So let me ask you guys, why? Why did you decide to have a family? I mean, what is your why, you know, behind your approach to family? Because I think that infuses your identity.
Absolutely. I would say a big driving factor for me and for us collectively is being able to change the trajectory of our family tree. So when you look back generations after generations before us, you see all of this dysfunction. And so a big driver for me was, I've always been family oriented, so I always knew I wanted kids. But I didn't want the hurts and the obstacles that happened in me and to me to prevent that dream from coming to a reality. I can see the obstacle, I can see the challenge that some people would have with that. But I took it as an opportunity for God to work through what He's done in us, reproduce that in our children, and to be able to change the direction that our family genealogy is heading. And so we get to set a new standard. We get to right the ship and head in a new direction.
Mandy, you want to chime in on that, or?
I can. To me, it was very important to me because I, as well, am very family oriented. Even though my family was crazy and all of the problems that
I think everybody's got some crazy
Yeah.
in
Got some
it.
crazy.
Yeah.
even though it was so crazy and all of the things that I went through as a child, part of my family, not all of my family, was that way. There was a part of my family, and still to this day, we are extremely close. We're connected. We can really be ourselves around each other, and that's never changed. And I really wanted that. I wanted my family and our family to develop that, and for the rest of the family to for us to be the light so that everyone else could see what good it could be and not the brokenness. And then I believe at the same time that I strongly feel that God, He made Eve for a reason. And I believe that, it was my job and my duty to be a helpmate to someone. That is one of my core. I'm a servant. I love to help. And so I needed that because God made me that way. And not everyone is made that way, but I do believe that you're stronger when you are together because you can really grow from each other. And just iron sharpens iron. You can push each other and encourage each other in those areas.
And I want to encourage you, if you're watching and you are struggling with, why would I even reproduce a family? If that's a dream in your heart, I want to encourage you, don't give up. I look at, when you step back and you look at the bigger picture of things, if you never begin to right the ship, society just continues to get worse and worse and worse. We talk a lot about in our relationship, in our conversations, how hurt people hurt people,
Yep.
and how healed people heal people.
Absolutely.
So if we don't in ourselves, in our I factors, and even in the way we raise our children, if we don't produce healed people, then society as a whole just continues to get more and more hurt and more broken.
That's good. So much you said. There's so many things firing in me and jumping in me. Let's talk to parents that may be watching, whether they're single parents, whether they are a perfect family unit like you guys or my wife and I, and however you define perfection. But let's talk about strategies and principles that you guys are fond of that help to raise healthy children. Because you talked about hurt people, and healed people heal people. What are some of the things that you guys do to intentionally plant some of those seeds in your beautiful children? And let me specify a little bit more. The book really revolves around three key things. I talk about that the I factor is about leading yourself well, that it's really about the relationship you have with yourself. And I found that in order to have a healthy I factor, it really revolves around what I consider three key things: identity, significance, and perspective. You don't have to chime in on all three, but out of the three, talk to me about some of the core principles or approaches that's near and dear to you all's heart that you are intentional to plant into the children, or the way that you plant into the way that you deal with these subjects and plant these principles into the kids so that you make sure that they're growing in a healthy manner.
Sure. I think so our two children are 10 and 6 now, and I think the identity and the significance has been the easier part of it. Just from a very early age, we help them understand that they're unique, that they're wired differently than the rest of us for a very specific reason. God created them that way so that He could do something great through them one day. And their significance of being a part of the family, their significance of being here, and their significance of being in their environments. That's been a little easier for us. It's just been a day-by-day conversational type thing. I think as they get older, the perspective is really where we're having to shift.
Yeah.
And helping them as they get older understand dealing with their emotions, dealing with their feelings. You know, we joke about my son when he was younger, he'd get angry and he'd just go into Hulk mode and, you know, hit something,
Hulk
kick
smash.
something. Yeah.
Right.
And, you know, and so we're trying to coach him very relationally. I think
Yeah.
that's the big thing that was missing in some of my background.
Yep.
It was more authoritarian. Do
Yep.
this, don't do that, or you get the consequences.
Yep.
And there is some of that in the growth phase of children, but we approach it from a very relational perspective of, hey, listen, those feelings you have right now, anger, frustration, whatever it is, God gave that to you for a reason. But if you don't learn to control it, it's going to have significant consequences. So we do it very, very relationally, very situation upon situation. It requires a lot of conversation between us.
Oh, yeah.
It's very important for us to have a unified approach. I grew up in a house where I could play mommy and daddy a little bit. I could
Yep.
say, Mom, oh, hey, Dad, Mom
Yep.
said I couldn't, but
Yep.
would you let me? And,
Yep.
and
I
don't,
think that's the constant test of kids.
absolutely. So unified approach. And then honestly, one thing we've started doing recently that has paid great dividends for us is once a year just kind of taking a retreat weekend, just the two of us, and spending some time in prayer and looking at each of our children. Spending time thinking about the qualities and the traits that we see,
Yeah.
and then saying, God, okay, what are we seeing? And then what do we want to help produce in them this next year? And really just coming together as a team and formalizing a strategy to say, we can't do everything at once.
Yeah.
What can we focus on for the next few months? What can we focus on for the next year so that we can see our kids getting healthier and raising?
Yeah. You know, it was so interesting about what you said is that in the book I talk about, I really am tired of the sad epidemic of self-sabotage, you know, of so many people that are full of gifts and talents and opportunities, and they crash and burn because they have focused on all of the external stuff, but haven't done the real work of making sure that they're healthy on the inside. And I think that principle applies to any situation, parenting, raising kids. But I think one of the things that's so significant about getting to a healthy I factor is that it is intentional, meaning it's not just going to happen overnight.
Right.
You're not going to rub a lamp and be healthy on the inside out. It does take intentionality. And I love that because I hear that when you guys talk about taking a retreat, pulling away with the express purpose to not just rest, but to say, okay, let's talk about our family. How are we doing? Let's talk about what we're noticing with our kids. And we hit on that a little bit earlier. You can maybe have it and feel like you got a good handle on it, maybe when the kids are 5 and 6, but the older they get, that changes,
Yeah.
which I think then demands that every family intentionally do that. So you may be watching and say, okay, I think my family's pretty healthy. I think the way that we're raising our kids is pretty healthy from an I factor standpoint. And that's great, but don't become too comfortable, because what happens when they get a few years older, all of that changes. And so I think it's just proof positive of the work that all parents have to do collectively. And even if you're parenting by yourself, it's still the work that you have to do to make sure that you are healthy and that you're also planting those seeds into the life of your children so that they can be healthy as well. So let me ask you this in one kind of final thought, because we could talk for a while on this subject, because like you, my wife and I are really, really passionate about family and parenting. And I just think the family is sacred. I also think the family's under attack. And I think that as believers, we've got to stand up. But I also think practically we've got to empower people so they have the right tools. Because a lot of families that are fractured and splintered, it's not for desire. It's just that nobody really ever had any other wisdom on the subject. They didn't know how to do it. So in light of that, and in light of the message of the I Factor and how it's really been impacting you guys' life, I want you to take a second and just share something from your heart to all of the parents that may be watching. Why is this subject critical? Why do you think the book is important? And not just the book, just the message of getting healthy from the inside out. Share maybe a final thought from your heart, and then we'll close.
Sure. I'll go first, give you a moment to think.
Thank you.
I think the significance of the book as it relates to yourself, when you look at, especially at parenting, what you're basically doing is you're reproducing yourself. You tend to reproduce your qualities and your characteristics. And I can look across my family and so many other families and see the results, the devastating results of an unhealthy I factor.
Wow.
Not being able to cope, not being able to process feelings and emotions, and just how much of a train wreck that can produce in people's life.
Wow.
And so I know that my encouragement for you that are watching this and getting the book and reading the book is you can't reproduce something until it first happens in you. So the
good.
more you focus on yourself and the more you get healthy, you'll begin walking in the peace and the joy, the abundant life that God calls for, because now you're healthy, and then you can reproduce that health into your children and even into your other relationships. And I've seen it in my life. That's kind of my testimony. Childhood wasn't perfect growing up, had issues, but allowed God to work on those issues and allowed God to work on my confidence, my identity, my significance, my perspective, to where now, as the youngest child in the family, I've almost taken the seat of the patriarch of the family, and I'm leading the rest of my family into a season and a stage of health. Had I not allowed God to do that, my family dynamic could look very, very different over the next 10 to 15 years.
Wow, that's good.
And I just want to take a second and talk to all the moms out there just for a minute. We have a lot on our plate, especially those of us, whether you work or you stay home, you are the ones in your child's lives the most. And that can be very straining, and you can lose your I factor and your identity in doing that, to the point that when it's time for them to go, that you no longer know yourself. And so you have to take the time out to spend time just yourself, spend time with your girlfriends. Make sure you don't lose yourself in the process of raising your kids, because they need to see that you can withstand, and that when they become parents, they don't have to lose themselves either. And you don't need to feel bad when you take time for yourself, because you need it. You can't produce healthy children if you're not healthy yourself.
That's so good. I often say that recreation and recreation spell the same way for a reason. You've got to take time out for you to make sure that you're healthy, so that the contributions you make to your children and to everywhere that you are is healthy. Well, thank you guys for being a part of this week's I Factor conversation. And to those of you that are watching, if you haven't already, I want to encourage you, go to the local bookstore, pick up your copy of the I Factor. You can also get a copy at ifactorbook.com. And beyond having additional information about the book on the website, there's also an I Factor assessment. I want to encourage you to just take about 3 minutes. It may not even take you that long. Go out to ifactorbook.com and take the free assessment to determine how healthy your I factor is. You may be surprised. There's some of you who are watching who may say, oh, I've got this thing together and I'm good. But then let's find out. Take the assessment. There may be those of you who may have looked at Jacin and Mandy and said, well, they've got it all together and their family's perfect. And you think that maybe you're so far away from where you want to be, but you may be surprised. You may be further down the road than you've given yourself credit for. So that's why we put that free assessment out there. It's a great assessment, and it's a great tool that will challenge you to really think inwardly and think deeply, and will give you the results of how healthy your I factor is. So once again, all of that's free, and it's available out at ifactorbook.com. Thank you guys for being a part of this week's I Factor conversation, and we'll see you next week. Take care.